All right, here we go with a five-step process model of conflict. It's actually my goal to help you see that this particular model can be applied situationally to any conflict that you have. I guess the main thing is really to recognize that conflict should be looked at in a situational manner. So let's get started with the five stages of this model. The first stage, as you've all experienced, is frustration. And this frustration can easily be triggered by an event that happens. Sometimes for me, it's just a quick email that when I see a name in my inbox, usually from one of my relatives, I immediately feel the sensation, which is the physical reaction part of this listed underneath. Maybe you hear your frustration might be triggered by a song on the radio that makes you think of a specific person, or perhaps you just see something, but typically your frustration is triggered by some quick event based thing. And that's what gets the whole model started. Once you experience that, in my opinion, conceptualization is the most important part. Conceptualization is the part where you really need to start thinking about it and analyzing what you think went on before you jump into the next stage, which is behavior. And I can't tell you enough how often this stage is overlooked. Like, how many times have you just acted so quick before you take the time to try and analyze the situation? One of my classic examples of this has to do with email. I know that you could just so quickly respond to an email by just hitting reply and just shooting off with your response before you take the time to try and wonder why something might have occurred. And when you take the time to actually analyze something, and you might really, change how you respond to a conflict before you do something that you might regret. In the next slide, as you already know, you're going to see there's so many choices for how to handle things, but the conceptualization stage where maybe you want to think of external attributions versus internal attributions, and then maybe you'd have a better frame of mind. Maybe you want to take this time to get more information, but this is definitely one of those things that is very, very important to do before you act, which is the next phase. So behavior is the third part of this. And you're already familiar with five of the stages of conflict resolution. A lot of you in your reflection papers have talked about using avoidance because, on the one hand, obviously it's very passive. You don't have to deal with anything. But as most of you realize, that doesn't mean the conflict goes away. If it's a really important conflict, I'm sure that you've even indicated that it sets the stage for a later explosion. And that's one of those things that, if you don't go back to that previous conceptualization stage, you can see that could really blow up in your face. But sometimes it's important to avoid if the issue doesn't matter, if it's trivial, like arguing with your mom about what kind of nuts to have in your salad for your wedding. I mean, there's so many things that don't matter. Or, if a conflict doesn't even involve you, that's another area we're avoiding. And then when you make the choice to collaborate, which we call the yes dear strategy, where you just kind of give in and say, hey, you're right. That's great for certain things. But if you use it all the time, it's kind of a sophisticated use of avoidance when you just give in, but you don't really want to. And people will take advantage of you if you're constantly just giving in. Oh, that's fine, whatever you want. That's just kind of can be seen sometimes as reasonable, but not always. Then, when you look in the middle at compromising, believe it or not, compromise is actually seen not as a win-win like you might think, but as a lose-lose strategy. Why, you might ask? Because a lot of times people think about what they had to give up if each party is giving something up. and not necessarily what they're gaining. And then competing, when you look up at the top, is a win-lose, as you probably know. It's like, maybe you just want the conflict resolved your way. You want it resolved quickly. If you're bargaining for a car or something, you don't really care so much about the outcome. If you're a manager and you really want your employees to just do something your way, that sometimes you might pull that kind of authority over them. And then the collaboration box, the orange one, is the one that's win-win. It's the only one that's win-win, but that's the one where everyone needs to decide that it's worth collaborating, that it's worth taking the time. All of these behavior strategies come with advantages and disadvantages. And the key is really, again, to just think about your relationship, think about the situation. I love to accommodate, especially if I know I'm wrong. And, sometimes admitting that you're wrong is not the easiest thing in the world. But at the same time, sometimes it's easier to just sort of give in if it's not that big of a deal. On the other hand, if it is a big deal, then you'll know it. And you'll know it based on you can just see how important the issue is for you. And if it's not important, you might choose a passive strategy. So it's just really interesting if you situationally based, but definitely take the time to think beforehand. Once you get through that, then you have to deal with stage 4, which is the other person's reaction, right? So if you've had that kind of conflict episode where you just sort of blew up, or you get a reaction that you aren't even really expecting. I actually had a friend, this is crazy. She and her husband share an email account for some reason. And so she logs onto this shared email account where a mutual friend had written to her husband and referenced the time they slept together. Boy, talk about frustration, right? Like that's that's unbelievable. So luckily she had hours to go to the conceptualization phase, because in that conceptualization phase, she had hours to try and analyze what happened. She also had time to calm down before her husband walks in and she just jumped all over him. If you have time to think, take it, right? Strangely enough, when her husband finally did come home, she had all that time to think. She didn't just jump all over him, but she just calmly said, "Honey, why don't you sit down and read your email?" So when he read the email from the friend, she could see his facial expression changing and all this. The whole point is that when it came to his reaction, the other reaction, he actually started to cry. And that blew her away. So once she saw that he was crying, she was confused. She was just like, what is going on? And finally, after all that, it led to a conflict outcome much later where, they ended up deciding to kind of stay together. But after you go back and you think after the other person's reaction, at the very end of this, you get an outcome of some kind. And sometimes that outcome can be something as basic as, well, the conflict is now over, but so is the relationship. Or if you've ever experienced a conflict and felt much closer to someone, conflict outcomes sometimes can be very, very positive because you've taken the time to go through it. Some of these conflicts are really worth going through, and some of them are definitely worth avoidance. But if you ever got to that productive stage where a conflict made you understand more about yourself, or, you feel closer to another person, or you got something that you really wanted at work because you took the time to go through these stages, that's what's really special about conflict and choosing how to handle it. And how you really learn what is important to you and what isn't. So I really like this model because I think it applies to conflicts with people who are very, very important in your life. And, I just hope that you got a little bit from this as well. Conflict's great if it's managed properly and you take the time to think.